Hey everybody, Mark Salas here with Best Realty. I got Trey Whitlock. He's an insurance specialist. We got a bunch of questions that relate to buying a home, or even if you're on the other side and you're selling a home, these are things that you really should know. So Trey, one of the first ones I want to talk about is a big deal. Assessments. We have a couple types of assessments out there. You can have a loss assessment, you can have a special assessment. This is from a homeowners association. Now, special assessment, typically that's not something that's going to be covered by insurance. That's when your HOA says, hey, we need a new fence, and by the way, everybody, we need you to pitch in for the fence. That's not a claim that we can file.
There's not a loss that's associated with it. Typically, that's going to be wear and tear, or
maintenance of the property.
Yeah, maintenance of the property.
Okay.
There's potholes in the in the parking lot.
And there's really no insurance that will protect you for that, right?
Typically not, because insurance is truly meant for sudden and accidental damage.
Okay.
Not wear and tear or loss over time. So you're not going to have things that are wear and tear issues, which would be like, the fence just getting old and, some of the post rotting, that kind of stuff.
That makes sense.
That's not sudden and accidental damage. That's,
over time.
Happened over time.
Yeah,
So,
that's something that just ran through its life course and now it's time to be replaced.
Yep, and the same thing happens with the homeowner's insurance side of it. I mean, you don't have assessments typically on homeowners in general anyway, because that typically falls in a condominium association.
Exactly.
But the homeowners, I mean, in Colorado, we're all kind of used to getting our roofs done because we have hail here so often. But in other parts of the country where there's no hail, I mean, your 30-year roof, once it hits 30 years, you're not getting a new roof from the insurance company. That roof has lasted its lifetime. You're going to be paying it out of pocket as a wear and tear issue on your house.
There you go. So after it's this old, it doesn't matter. It's ran through its course and the insurance looks at it like, hey, listen, it did its job. It's 30 years old. We're not replacing it. We're not giving you any money for it.
Yeah, you wouldn't expect on a wear and tear on a roof that's gotten that old,
okay,
that you would be getting, it replaced just because it got old.
Gotcha.
It's actually done its job, and it's just one of the upgrades you have to do to your house at that time.
Now, that brings us to a loss. So we're talking about a loss. Say, 2 years ago, what was it, 2018, we had all those hailstorms here in Colorado Springs. We kind of just tore stuff up, and we had them back to back. So we had people putting on a brand new roof, and then the next week, another hailstorm came in, just completely tore it up. So from an HOA standpoint, that would be a loss assessment, and at that point in time, that's something that we would call the insurance agent and say, hey, listen, we just had a loss, the roof needs to be replaced. And my experience is you've been one of the only companies to back that up. And what I mean by that is I have some other clients, even myself, on some of my properties that I own, and my insurance company on some of the other ones, they wouldn't back up the claim, or they only backed it up to a certain amount. So when we get loss assessment, this is one thing that I always tell my clients, it's very important that we ask for an amount. What do you usually recommend whenever we do a loss assessment?
Anymore, I recommend the max amount that the company will let you do. In my case, that's $50,000 of loss assessments, which typically is going to cover any assessment, because most of the bylaws and the CC&Rs for the HOA are going to outline what the max that the assessment is allowed to be within that HOA.
Okay.
Now they can amend those bylaws and stuff, but typically you see 10 to 15,000 as the max that they'll ask for. But it's always better to be overinsured, and in that case, 50,000 is not a lot more in cost than 20,000 or 10,000. So you might as well make sure that you're covered there.
So what that means, and I get a lot of my clients when we're going through the contracts and I'm saying, all right, this line item is this line item is this. Their eyes usually open up when I tell them the bad. Like, this is what this means. So what I had a client who bought a home. We were under contract. We had a hailstorm. It totaled out the roof. Okay, now the HOA owns the roof. The individual does not own the roof. So we closed. 5 months later, the HOA deems that it's a loss. And at that point in time, that's when you guys say, yes, we recognize it as a loss, because that's when the homeowners association who owns the roof deemed that it was a loss. Am I correct?
It depends on the company, honestly.
Yes.
Some companies will go by the date that the assessment was voted on within the directors for the HOA.
Okay.
Others go back to the actual loss date, and it depends on which company you're with and how they do their loss assessment coverage as to whether you needed to have that coverage on there during the date of loss, or whether it needed to be on there just before the assessment actually was sent out to the customers.
Exactly. So that's a huge point, because in this case, the client didn't own the property.
Right.
He didn't own it for another month. We had just went under contract, and boom, we got a hailstorm. The owner says, hey, we're going to take care of everything. However, they did have a roofer come over there and look at their specific unit, but once again, they do not own the roof.
Correct.
So now we closed on the property. Client says, hey, listen, I'm good. I got insurance. We have a loss 5 months later, and his insurance company says, we're not protecting you. And the reason we're not protecting you is because you did not own the property when you had the loss.
And that one gets to be a sticky situation, because who does it fall on? The original property owner who had the house at the time of the loss?
Yep.
Or the one who has it at the time of the assessment?
And at that point in time, the original property owner no longer has insurance on the property.
Correct.
So their insurance company can say, you canceled the policy, we're not covering you.
And
Right?
again, it depends on how that company handles loss assessments.
Correct.
Because a insurance policy, whether it's canceled or not, if you had coverage on the date of loss. So what's going to determine whether that would be covered by that original policy is whether they go by the date of loss being the hailstorm, or they go by the date of loss being the special assessment. So if you had coverage, even if you don't currently have coverage, but if you had coverage back on that date and that's how they do it, then that may be covered.
Okay. All right, so we got two entities here that we'd be working with.
Yeah.
So one entity says this, we better hope that the other entity says something that aligns where the client is able to get that loss paid. Because some of these losses, what's the highest loss you've seen?
I've seen about 9,800, I think, is the biggest one that I've seen come in that I'm aware of.
So that's a big payment, you know, and especially if I got a first-time home buyer who, put $1,000 down on a home, they got into a property, and all of a sudden they just get hit with a $9,800 bill. That's huge.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
And we should probably explain what the assessment actually is. So an HOA, if you have 40 buildings, each one of those buildings has a specific value for the insurance, what the insurance coverage is for that building. And what happens is, if you have a hailstorm, you have 40 buildings all get their roofs and siding wiped out all at the same time. Well, HOAs have a different style of deductible typically than your own home does. They'll have a 5 or maybe even 10% deductible.
It's a commercial policy, right? So it's more of a deductible.
Correct.
Yep.
And what happens is they take the total value of those buildings, and then if your deductible is 10%, then the
Okay.
HOA has to come up with a 10% of that value. So if it was $22 million of buildings, the deductible is 10% of 22 million.
And then that's divided between all the homeowners,
And then it gets divided
all the
amongst
homeowners
every
gotta
unit.
pay up.
Correct. So that's how an assessment typically ends up happening is, HOAs don't keep on hand all that money for a deductible. They have this special, or this loss assessment,
Specifically for that.
clause
Yep.
in order to be able to stay solvent.
Yep. So it's very important whenever we're looking at a property with a homeowners association, generally condominiums and townhomes. We don't see
Correct.
this on the single family homes where the neighborhood has a fence or they have a park. We see this more or less where it's almost like a co-op. Everybody has
If you have
ownership.
shared walls,
Yep.
usually, because it's impossible to separate this unit from this unit when they have a shared roof, shared walls. It does happen, but in Colorado, in general, the unit owner is responsible for their interior coverage, while the HOA is responsible for the exterior coverage.
So it's a big deal. So it's so important that you do your due diligence whenever you're looking for an insurance agent. It's just as important. In the contract, we have a line item. You have time to get out. These are some of the questions that you should be asking. How much is my loss assessment coverage? So people will give you loss assessment coverage, but I've had it where they say, yeah, we'll give you $1,000.
Right.
Well, if you get a $9,800 bill and you got $1,000 loss assessment coverage, that's not very.
It's something, but you're not going to be happy.
Yeah, and then on top of that, they probably have their deductible, right?
Correct.
So
There is a deductible.
we do have a deductible. And the other thing I tell my clients, it's super inexpensive, but you gotta ask for it. I mean, you know, we're talking.
And it depends on who you're going through. I mean, if you're going through an agent, most companies that use agents, the agent is going to know that if it's a condo, you better have loss assessments on there. If you're going through a company that's a call center, I mean, they may not know. It may not be
It's the difference
Colorado
between
specific in their heads because they're not dealing with just Colorado.
Very true.
So
it could be the difference, just like car insurance. You can have insurance that's super inexpensive. Yes, you got insurance and you feel like you're covered,
Yeah.
but you don't know until you have a problem. When you have a problem, that's where you really want the backing of your insurance agent and the company that you've used.
correct, because insurance, I mean, it's one of the only things where the insurance company isn't selling an actual product. They're selling essentially a promise that when something does happen, we're going to live up to whatever the options that you selected on that policy are.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So having somebody who can educate you what options you need for your specific instance, that's where the agent comes in and is a useful tool.
So, and that's where you should, I guess you shouldn't really get to know, but you're gonna get to know your agent when you have problems. That's why I like doing business with people face to face, because if I have an issue, I call you on the phone. I say, hey, listen, I got this issue. You're like, all right, Mark, take care of it.
And
Send
you
it
call
over.
me, you're always going to speak to somebody in the office that knows you.
Yeah.
You call a call center, you could get a different person
Yeah.
every time for the whole term that you have insurance through that company.
So very important.
Yep.